frost-free dates, growing degree days, and hardiness zones. This presentation was created through a collaboration between the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. Please contact the conservation planners at your regional NRCS office for questions on the topic. Frost-free dates, growing degree days, and hardiness zones. Applications for Alaska. This presentation was created by Dr. Patricia Holloway for the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts. Ever since temperature recording technology has been around, farmers and researchers have been interested in the ability to predict crop growth by attempting to correlate it with air temperature. The warmer the air temperature, up to a point, the better and faster the growth. Three of the most common temperature measurements used in agriculture are frost-free days, growing degree days, and hardiness zones. Models have been created at lower latitudes for major agricultural crops, and their complexity has increased with every new technological advancement in temperature and crop measurement. In Alaska, the lack of long-term reliable temperature data, spotty crop information, and the size and diversity of Alaska's agricultural communities has hampered the use of temperature models for reliable crop growth predictions. Rather, frost-free days, growing degree days, and hardiness zones are mostly used to paint a broad picture of seasonal weather patterns and plant growth survival that are interesting but not often useful to farmers, crop consultants, and agency personnel. The purpose of this presentation is to describe the concepts of frost-free days, growing degree days, and hardiness zones, show how they're measured, describe their usefulness to farmers and gardeners, and suggest ways that they can be used in the future. The measurement of frost-free days, growing season length, is the oldest and simplest temperature correlation with crop growth, and it's often used to determine the type of plants that can be grown in a region, as well as planting and harvest dates for vegetables, flowers, some fruits, and agronomic crops. The term frost-free is a bit misleading because frost can occur on plants at temperatures above freezing, up to 36 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, often with little injury to the crop. We will use a term becoming more frequent in the literature, freeze-free. The time between the last date in spring and the first date in fall when the temperatures reach 32 degrees Fahrenheit is historically considered the frost-free or freeze-free season. However, many plants grown in Alaska do not show freezing damage at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Growers and researchers who record the freeze-free season often use 28 degrees as a killing temperature and even lower if the crop is a native plant. NRCS uses a scale of freeze damage in its wetlands (WETS) model that might be useful for agricultural situations. 32 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit is a light freeze. Tender plants are killed with little destructive effect on other vegetation. From 28 down to 25 is a moderate freeze, widely destructive effect on most vegetation with heavy damage to fruit, blossoms, tender, and semi-hardy plants. 24 and below is a severe freeze, with heavy damage to most plants. At these temperatures, the ground begins to freeze solid. The depth the ground freezes depends on the duration and the severity of the freeze, the soil moisture, and the soil type. When you're looking at the data, or maps, it's important to identify the temperatures used by these reporting services. Some use 32 degrees Fahrenheit, some 30 degrees, and some 28 degrees, and so on. Nationally, the length of the freeze-free season is used to measure changes in the overall growing season and indications of climate change. The freeze-free season across the nation has been lengthening since at least the 1980s. It's worth mentioning that historically, the measurement of freeze-free season in Alaska has been through mercury or alcohol thermometers and personal observations. However, global freeze-free data are compiled by satellite data. Satellite microwave sensors are used to determine the frozen or thawed status of water on the land surface at a given time, and all the vegetated land areas where seasonal frozen temperatures are a major constraint to plant growth. While invaluable for identifying global trends, these data are not very practical for the home gardener or the farmer. Climate modelers are also interested in trying to predict how the growing season will change over time. Compared to the top map that illustrates the situation of the decade from 2010 to 2019, the entire state is predicted to have a longer growing season by 2060 to 2069, as shown by the middle map. It's difficult to see individual locations on the map, but it appears that Fairbanks will add an entire month to its growing season over 40 years. In Alaska, the most complete and relevant records of freeze-free seasons are found with the local weather stations that are then compiled and summarized by the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Weather stations associated with the Ag Experiment Stations have complete records that are sometimes correlated with crop growth. The government statistics don't report on a particular date, but rather the probability of a freeze-over event on various dates. So, using the data from the Fairbanks Airport, there's a 10% chance of a 32-degree frost on August 24th, but the likelihood of a 32-degree frost increases to 50% after September 6th. Using these published charts, different locations can be compared. The probability of observing a temperature of 32 degrees or colder is 10% on August 24th in Fairbanks, and about 2 weeks later at the Matanuska Experiment Farm as shown in this data. The probability rises to 50% in Fairbanks the first week of September, but it's about a week and a half later in the Matanuska Experiment Farm. It should also be noted that the choice of a single spring and fall date to identify the growing season for a region is quite misleading in many parts of Alaska, where freezing temperatures can occur any month of the year. To label Fairbanks, Alaska as having a 110-day growing season does not show the incredible variations from the frost-prone Goldstream Valley with temperatures routinely dipping into 20 degrees every month to the mild hillsides that can have a freeze-free period 1 to 4 weeks longer than the valley. Every region has incredible variability. This chart of first frost dates in the Tanana Valley illustrates how different microclimates can vary. The UAF experiment farm is slightly higher in elevation and only 4 miles south of the airport, yet the freeze dates for 2020 differed by 19 days. The Steese Hills had nearly a 4-week extension to the frost-free season compared to the experiment farm, but the Goldstream Valley, always a cold spot, froze 18 days earlier. Growers must have their own weather stations to identify conditions on their site. Growers try to use freeze-free season or growing season length to predict which crops and varieties will grow well in their area. If the published maturity days for a certain variety are less than the length of the freeze-free growing season, it should work, right? Gardeners will use the dates listed in commercial catalogs and compare them with the overall growing season days. A turnip that matures in 60 days will easily fit into the 110-day growing season in Fairbanks or the 145-day growing season of Matanuska. A study conducted at the UAF Matanuska Experiment Station and the Alaska Plant Materials Center compared real field days to maturity with the days listed in the commercial catalogs. Some were pretty close, but others were far apart. It seems like the short season varieties compare fairly well, but the late season varieties have the greatest discrepancies. It's interesting to note that Alaska 6467 was bred in Alaska by Dr. Arvo Kilio in Fairbanks as a late-season storage cabbage. It's been successfully grown for many years, although the seed's no longer available. According to the results of the Matanuska Experiment Farm, it should barely make it. The growing season at the Matanuska Farm is 145 days, and in Fairbanks, it wouldn't mature in time before the fall freeze-up. The warm season crop okra is a vegetable that some people would love to grow in Alaska. A catalog description of the jambalaya variety shows that 6 to 8 week transplants will mature in 50 to 55 days. If you planted transplants on June 1st, that means you should be harvesting okra the week of July 20th. Not going to happen unless climatic change is drastic and chaotic. Even direct-seeded Go Big okra from Burpees has a maturity date of 60 to 65 days. These numbers are deceptively short and totally unrealistic based solely on freeze-free days. Even with the aid of high tunnels, okra is not a sure crop in many locations in Alaska with 80 to 300 frost-free days. The freeze-free season is not necessarily the same as planting season or growing season. Even with air temperatures above freezing, soils can be frozen or so cold they inhibit germination and growth. Many agronomic crops can be seeded before the last freeze event, and there are a number of gardeners who sow seeds such as carrots, turnips, and rutabagas in the fall for spring germination. These seeds can tolerate being frozen. Direct-seeded horticultural crops are planted based on soil temperature, soil moisture, and plant cold tolerance in addition to, or instead of, the spring freeze-free dates. On the other hand, species such as snap beans will rot in the soils where temperatures are not above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the last freeze date, it's best to wait until the soil warms up with these crops. Instead of exact growing season dates, horticulturalists often lump maturity information into early, mid, and late season. Maturity dates are not predicted, but a range of dates is fitted to the response of the varieties. Even within a variety, the maturity dates can vary significantly, more than 20 days, as in some of the varieties in this cabbage trial. Rather than relying on listed catalog maturity dates, actual data on maturity dates from Alaska should be compared with the frost-free season. Horticultural crops can be divided into two main categories related to their tolerance of chilling and sometimes freezing temperatures and optimum growing season temperatures: the warm season crops and the cool season crops. Even though they're often transplanted, many of the cool season crops can be direct seeded. For many crops, even the transplants can tolerate light frosts. They can be sown before or just after the last spring freeze date. Cool season crops are also more tolerant of fall frosts. The growing season as measured by freeze events is not necessarily the most important gauge of crop success. Most warm season crops need to be planted as seedling transplants or beneath soil-warming polyethylene mulch or tunnels. During the growing season, they can be susceptible to chilling injury, which is damage caused by temperatures above freezing. Chilling temperatures may not kill the plant, but they can kill the flowers, reduce yields, discolor fruit, and more. The average dates of the spring freeze and first fall freeze are much more important to the warm season crops than the cool season crops when they're grown outdoors. Soil temperatures are equally as important as air temperature in predicting crop success of the warm season crops. Individual farm temperature records can provide a ballpark estimate of freeze occurrence on the microclimate scale. Of course, there are so many methods growers use to extend the season beyond the freeze-free season that growing season data does not reliably predict crop production, with all the variations of high and low tunnels, raised beds, plastic mulches, and greenhouses that are used in Alaska. Each of these changes the microclimate around the plant, which fundamentally changes soil and air temperatures. Unfortunately, there's no consistent, long-term information on how these structures extend the season, except comparisons that growers might make on their own farms. Depending on the location, season extenders can make it possible to grow apples, plums, and even peaches in Alaska, get double crops of cool season crops, get marginal long season crops to mature, and increase overall productivity. Growing season dates are not as useful in predicting crop success in these controlled environments as they are in the open fields. Data on growing season length and freeze-free periods are hard to find for most locations in Alaska unless there's a government weather station nearby. Even then, published data are often limited to the official weather station raw data. Very few communities in Alaska have such detailed records, and it's often difficult to sift through the national and local databases to find the bits of information. Unfortunately, research data often lasts only as long as the research project itself does. Consequently, published data usually are broad brush guesstimates rather than hard and fast numbers that a grower can use with confidence on their own farm. Maturity dates for many vegetables and grains are available from annual reports of crop trials from the Agricultural Experiment Station and the Alaska Division of Agriculture, but they're limited in years and are often ended when the researcher retires or leaves. Climate scientists will often recommend that a minimum of 30 years of data are necessary for meaningful climate crop growth predictions, and rarely do we have that. Growers truly interested in freeze-free and growing season data should invest in their own on-farm data loggers to capture the patterns of their own specific microclimates. A more sophisticated measure of crop growth in relation to weather patterns is the use of growing degree days, GDD, growing degree units, GDU, or simply heat units. Growing degree days is a measure of heat accumulation during the growing season that may be used in predicting growth and development patterns in plants and animals. The concept of growing degree days finds applications by agronomists, horticulturalists, and farmers to identify the amount of heat needed to achieve a specific growth stage such as seedling emergence, bud development stage, crop maturity, and more. Ecologists and climate scientists also compare growing degree day accumulation over many years to predict changes in regional plant growth patterns and identify warming trends. It has interesting implications for predicting growth stages of plants and maturity days in Alaska, but it's plagued with the same limitations as frost-free data: hard to find weather data, limited crop response data, limited geographic applications, and short data collection timelines. In addition to plants, growing degree days are used by entomologists to predict growth stages of insects so that pest outbreaks can be predicted. Dr. Dennis Fielding, UAF Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station, has used growing degree days to model growth and emergence of grasshoppers in Alaska. Current research will also model growing degree days and root maggot development, a serious pest of root crops in Alaska. The concept of growing degree days is based on the idea that plants require a certain amount of heat to progress through their life cycle. Maximum and minimum air temperatures are recorded every day, and a daily temperature average is calculated. This temperature gives a relative indication of the warmth for a single day. A temperature reading might look like a high of 75 degrees and a low temperature of 45 degrees would give you an average temperature of 60 degrees for the date of June 10th. This average daily temperature is determined for every day in the growing season, from seeding or planting date to harvest date. It can be recorded by hand using a maximum-minimum thermometer, or automatically by using a data logger. You add up all the daily average temperatures for a certain length of time, and you'll get a measure of heat accumulation for that season. By itself, this number is strictly a temperature indicator. It's not related to plant or animal growth. Every crop has a temperature range within which it grows and matures. Below a certain temperature, growth is negligible, and most crop growth slows down above a temperature of 86 degrees. Assuming soil moisture is not limiting, the crop will continue to grow and add biomass above this minimum base temperature. Within their range, the warmer it is, the faster the plant will grow and develop. For broccoli, barley, and potatoes, growth will occur when the air temperatures rise above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Onions are more tolerant of cold, and they'll continue to grow and add biomass at a base temperature of only 35 degrees. In the hotter regions, an upper limit of 86 degrees Fahrenheit is often used because growth slows at very hot temperatures. Any day with a temperature reading above 86 degrees is automatically recorded as Tmax is 86. In Alaska, outside of high tunnels, so few days ever reach 86 degrees that it's usually not a factor in our growing degree calculations. Unfortunately, for many plants growing in Alaska, the appropriate base temperature is simply not known. This is true especially for Alaska native plants, including berries and native vegetables. Many northern plants begin growing when there's still ice in the soil, and the air temperature may be at or even below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of the diversity of crops grown and the lack of knowledge of appropriate base temperatures, Alaska growers and researchers often use a base air temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's often called TDD for thaw degree days. It's a ballpark that covers just about everything grown in Alaska. Since the data are not used to make precise predictions of the growth stages of a specific crop, it's probably more expedient to work with a base temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit for everything rather than individual crop-specific base temperatures. Again, this value paints a broad brush of seasonal warmth rather than precise predictions. Regardless of what the base temperature is used, it's important to check the source so you know which base temperature is used. This base temperature is subtracted from the average daily temperature to show the relative warmth above the baseline temperature for the specific crop. This formula relates the effects of air temperature with crop growth. For our example, the 60-degree average daily temperature minus a 40-degree base temperature gives you 20 growing degree units for the day. If you changed to a base temperature of 32 degrees and subtracted that, you would have accumulated 28 growing degree units for the day, so you can see why knowing which base temperature was used is important in the calculation. The growing degree units are added up every day from the beginning of the season or from a specific plant growing stage until the end of the season or another growth stage such as harvest. After many years, predictions can be made based on growing degree accumulation on the growth of the crop. The total accumulation is called cumulative growing degree days, or cumulative thaw degree days, and is shown here as the red line on the graph. In this example, a crop was planted on May 29th when the season already had 500 cumulative growing degree days, and the harvest was on August 7th when the season had 2,500 growing degree days. The cumulative growing degree days from planting to harvest would be 2,500 minus 500 is 2,000 growing degree days. Notice the chart also includes precipitation, the blue line. The growing degree day information is entirely dependent on adequate soil moisture from snowmelt, precipitation, or irrigation. Poor springtime moisture delays germination and influences all growing degree day predictions for the rest of the season by essentially wasting the heat units before the rains give enough moisture to allow for germination. This is an example of a portion of a datasheet for the Fairbanks Experiment Station using the calculations for growing degree days for the 2020 season. By May 17th, the cumulative growing degree days at the Fairbanks Experiment Station is 292.5 using a base of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of a lack of consistent long-term crop and weather data, the use of cumulative growing degree days in Alaska to predict individual crop harvest dates is rare. Often, cumulative growing degree or thaw degree data are used to provide a broad overview of the relative warmth of the season from year to year. This chart shows the wide variations in thaw degree days between 1991 and 2010 for the UAF Georgeson Botanical Garden. Longtime growers will remember the 1992 season as having a very late spring where farmers could not till their fields until June because of a very late snowfall in the last week of May. In the fall that season, permanent snowfall was also recorded the first week of September. Even though the heat accumulations on a daily basis during the growing season was not too much lower than other years, the entire frost-free season was significantly shortened. In the 1970s, there was a major effort to publish cumulative and growing degree data for many locations in Alaska, along with global radiation and other environmental characteristics. These publications provide a historic snapshot of growing degree days from the 1940s to the 1960s. They're not directly applicable to today, but it'd be interesting to compare the historic data with the current data, especially with the lengthening of the freeze-free season. There have been attempts to correlate growing degree days with crop growth and harvest dates in Alaska. Professor Lee Allen compiled ranges of growing degree days necessary for crop maturity at Palmer and found good correlation between growing degree days base 40 and harvest dates for many vegetables in Palmer. Again, the data are from the 1960s, and it would be interesting to make comparisons with present-day growing degree day data. The most comprehensive use of growing degree days and an evaluation of plant growth stages has been conducted by Robert van Veldhuizen at the Matanuska and Fairbanks Experiment Farms on a variety of agronomic crops. The growing degree days data are averaged over a 34-year time span for the entire growing season, as well as for individual growth stages for grains and other agronomic crops. The crop growth stages can be used in phenological modeling of crop growth and predicting the crop maturation dates. They can provide a good analysis of the seasonal warmth needed to grow agronomic crops in Alaska. In this example using barley, researchers tracked the number of days from planting to 50% seedling emergence, 50% heading or flowering stage, and 50% to physiologic maturity stage. The physiologic maturity stage is when seeds are mature enough to germinate. This stage can be days before the actual harvest date, but it's easier to quantify. Ironically, the harvest date is not easily predicted because the exact harvest dates are not based on just the weather, but a lot of physical and mechanical issues, many of which have nothing to do with plant maturity. You need several days of hot, dry weather before bringing the combines into the field so they don't get clogged with wet straw or grain. The grain might be mature, but sometimes the crop has to sit in the field until farming conditions are optimal. Is there adequate dryer space to hold the grain? Is the combine working properly? Is there enough labor available? In the chart, the growing degree days at the seeding date of May 12th is set to 0. Under optimal growing conditions, soil moisture, fertilizers, proper weather, it takes 5 to 10 days for barley to germinate and emerge. If the growing degree days accumulation is less than 525 units, 10 days after seeding, growers have a good idea that this particular variety will probably not mature by the end of the growing season. On average, it takes about 1,474 heat units or growing degree days to reach the heading stage from seeding, and 2,377 growing degree days to reach physiologic maturity. The crops will remain in the field beyond this point to allow the plant to dry and the protein content of the grain to reach 20%. Even with the variation in harvest dates due to non-weather events, an approximate number of growing degree days to mature different crop varieties can be estimated. This chart shows different varieties of barley and their average cumulative growing degree days from seeding. These numbers can be compared with the seasonal growing degree day averages to gain an estimate of whether or not a particular variety will grow well in all years or only in the warmest seasons. These growing degree day data can also be used to rank the varieties into early, mid, and late season variety categories. Notice the growing degree days were given, but we don't know which base temperature was used. The Alaska Climate Research Center calculated the growing degree days across the entire state. This chart provides a picture of overall warmth of seasons in many areas. Data are 29-year averages of seasonal cumulative growing degree days with a base temperature of 50 degrees. So, how many crops do you think will mature outdoors in Barrow, Utqiagvik, based on 8 growing degree days? Another method of attempting to predict plant growth by association with air temperatures is the USDA plant hardiness zones. The United States is divided into 13 zones with 26 subzones based on 30-year averages for the minimum winter temperature. The zones are based on average minimum temperatures, not the coldest temperature ever recorded for an area. Therefore, a region can have colder temperatures than described for the zone. The zones and subzones for the entire nation are divided into 5-degree increments ranging from -60 Fahrenheit to +70. At first it seems odd to be looking at average minimum temperatures as high as 70 degrees, but many tropical plants experience chilling injury at relatively cool temperatures well above freezing. Bananas, for example, show severe chilling injury if the temperature falls below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. If you know the lowest survival temperature of a plant, then it's possible to predict which plants are most likely to thrive at a particular location. With average minimum temperatures ranging from -60 degrees Fahrenheit to +20, Alaska has hardiness zones from 1A to 8B. If you choose specific locations on the USDA interactive map based on zip codes, the zones appear as illustrated in the sample list of town names. Even with this short list, it's evident that basing hardy plant lists solely on hardiness zones is inadequate. Most Alaskans would find it difficult to understand how Bettles, Fairbanks, and Utqiagvik could all be in the same zone. Utqiagvik has no trees, whereas Fairbanks is well forested with a nice list of hardy non-native perennials. There's a lot more to plant hardiness than average minimum temperature. We're all looking for the magic bullet that'll allow us to grow all kinds of perennials in Alaska, and it's very common to see recommendations on nursery labels declaring a plant to be hardy to Zone 1, or even hardy to -90 degrees Fahrenheit. Or, it's native to Alaska, therefore it's super hardy. Did you ever wonder where that information came from? There's no agency or research program dedicated to determining the low temperature limits of plants, especially the millions of ornamental varieties that are sold every year. Plant hardiness is such a complex phenomenon that it's not easily quantifiable. A big part of the story is the plant adaptation to different environments. The consequences of not getting it right can be devastating to the plant. We've all seen sun scald that occurs on sunny days in late winter and spring. Dark bark absorbs heat and warms even though the temperatures around the plants are still below freezing. The black bark holds the heat and the cells thaw. If the sun goes behind the cloud, cell membranes freeze and the tissues are killed. Frost cracks, cankers, needle burn, and top dieback are all indications that the plant is not reliably hardy in a region. The symptoms we see, including plant death, can occur any time of the year and any month under a number of environmental conditions. In order for a plant to be hardy, think of it as a year-round cycle, not just the deep cold winter. Think beyond a single hardiness zone. A perennial must adapt to the entire season of challenges, beginning with an active growth stage, followed by the period of acclimation, where the plants adapt to lower temperatures, a period of dormancy, and then a period of deep dormancy. This is followed by the deacclimation, where the plant returns to active growth, and the cycle starts all over again. Let's look a bit closer at some of these stages. During the period of active growth, buds open and the shoots elongate, flowers appear, and the fruits begin to form. Inside the plant, the cells are actively dividing. They're full of nutrients, hormones, and water. Tissues are succulent and tender, just the right stage for cold injury. The active growth state, in most instances, is the least hardy part of the cycle. Succulent tissues can be damaged by temperatures well above freezing or killed by a hard freeze in midsummer. Damage can be cosmetic, such as the browning of leaves, or it can be significant, such as the loss of flower buds, killing of young shoots, and more. A plant that cannot adapt to cold temperatures in midsummer can be just as vulnerable as a plant in midwinter exposed to the deepest winter freeze. Even native plants can be injured by temperatures above freezing if the temperature change is sudden and strong. Gardeners are well aware of the necessity to harden off young seedling transplants that have been grown inside a greenhouse or inside the home. Plants need time to adapt to the cool outdoor temperatures and stronger levels of sunlight. Humans can run inside and get another coat if they're cold. Plants are stuck. If the temperatures change too rapidly during the succulent growing season, say the sun goes behind a cloud on a very cold day, or the plants are moved from warm to cold temperatures rapidly, they could be injured or killed. Even hardy plants need to have time to change. In an experiment with lingonberries, or low bush cranberries, plants were moved from a warm 75-degree greenhouse and immediately placed outdoors at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 24 hours, the leaves were irreversibly damaged. In winter, lingonberries are hardy down to minus 20 degrees, but here they were killed at only 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The two photos in the slide show the differences between chilling injury on the top and winter dehydration injury on the bottom. Moving into autumn, winter buds form, growth ceases, and protective bark forms. Leaves change color, and plants gradually become dormant. They undergo a process called cold acclimation, where a combination of decreasing light, or increasing dark period, and lowering temperatures promotes the production of hardiness hormones that signal the plant to cease growth and become dormant. In subarctic plants, the process of cold acclimation can begin as early as the middle of July, while they still experience substantial photoperiod, somewhere in the range of 18 hours. In the upper Midwest, on the other hand, plants experience a longer summer. Appropriately, this triggers the cold acclimation process to occur later in the season. Photoperiods of 10 to 14 hours occurs in early fall, and cool temperatures may be 1 to 2 months later than in the subarctic regions. Consequently, if you take a plant from the upper Midwest and transplant it to Alaska, it's still on a Midwest seasonal clock, actively growing when most northern plants are beginning to acclimate. If, for instance, cold acclimation should begin to occur with an 18-hour photoperiod, That's still the middle of summer, an active growth phase for the plants of the upper Midwest, so these plants may be actively growing when they should be shutting down. These conditions might not be a problem in southeast Alaska, with their relatively mild fall weather, but in south central and especially in the interior, plants from the Midwest not in tune with local seasons might be in trouble. Significant cold injury can occur at temperatures that do not come anywhere near the minimum winter temperature. This seasonal alignment is especially critical for plants in their first year in Alaska. Even plants known to be hardy in Alaska can be killed in their first year because their seasonal cycle doesn't quite fit with nature. People often try plenty of things like starting growth early in a greenhouse, mulching heavily, or using lots of protection at the beginning of winter. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The most telltale sign that seasons don't align is the failure of leaves to change color or drop on deciduous plants. If you see plants that still have foliage hanging on through winter, if they're alive, they're right on the edge. Anything that shortens the autumn season, an unseasonably cold September for instance, can mean that a plant dies even if it's lived in an area for years. Once triggered by decreases in day length and temperature, plants continue to acclimate and change hardiness levels throughout the winter. Plants respond to colder temperatures by increasing their hardiness level down to the genetic limits of the plant. If the winter temperatures do not fall below the genetic limits of the plant, it could survive the winter. If the temperatures, the blue line, dip below the plant's hardiness limit, plant B's, the red line, the plant dies. Again, killing temperatures can be reached that may or may not be close to the hardiness zone limits. And fundamentally, the hardiness levels of so many plants are simply not known. There are a few plants that have been thoroughly studied, such as strawberries and other commercially important plants, but for the vast majority of cultivated and native plants, the seasonal killing temperatures and how they change throughout the winter are simply not known. Consequently, it's nearly impossible to predict which plants will thrive in a region based on hardiness zones. Even within the same plant, not all parts have the same hardiness levels. Roots are the least hardy part of the plant, but they're usually protected by soil. Without snow cover, a lot of the plants growing in the subarctic regions wouldn't be alive in Alaska because of root death. Flowers and flower buds are also very tender, and it's not uncommon to see where the snow line is on plants, like in the upper photo. Flowers beneath the snow will survive because they've been protected, while those that are above the snow line are dead. Once again, for most horticultural crops and native plants, the most vulnerable part of the plant or its killing temperature is not known. These are just a few of the challenges defining cold hardiness in plants. The cycle also includes plant dormancy, the timing and length of dormancy, and the entire process of deacclimation and its seasonal timing. Hardiness is a year-round event, and to narrow it down to a critical minimum temperature is unrealistic and creates a false picture of plant hardiness. We would all love to have a single number to inform us of a plant's potential success in our gardens and farms, but a lack of information on individual plant killing temperatures and the year-round nature of plant hardiness simply makes that impossible. Gardeners, farmers, agency personnel, and crop consultants should visit and support Alaska's public gardens, some of which conduct extensive trials of plant hardiness and long-term survival of plants. They should also join and contribute to local garden clubs and societies to share information about plant hardiness and survival. They should support research at local universities and public agencies that will identify the limits of growth and what it really takes to thrive in the north. And importantly, they should ignore the hardiness zone maps. In summary, 3 tools are used by growers to relate crop performance to weather and climate patterns: frost-free days, growing degree days, and hardiness zones. They can be used to predict crop survival and yield potential, harvest times, plant hardiness, and seasonal growth. All of them have limitations in Alaska, due in part to the lack of long-term weather and climate data for accurate crop predictions, in a state more than twice the size of Texas. Long-term crop growth information is also lacking, especially in the diverse Alaska farming regions that range from permafrost farms to coastal temperate rain gardens. These tools are used mostly to paint a broad picture of seasonal weather patterns and give a rough indication of plant growth and survival. For farmers, the greatest value comes when they establish on-farm weather stations and keep detailed records of crop growth over many years. Thank you very much. This presentation is a collaboration between the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. The content of this presentation was created by Dr. Patricia Holloway, and it was narrated and slightly modified by Dr. Jeffrey Smenk. Thank you very much.